So we have an excellent panel here, leaders, practitioners, and experts. And we're going to try to unravel this enigma. What is it going to take to really supercharge our region economically, to catalyze productivity, to have sustained growth, but more importantly, to have inclusive growth, shared prosperity? And so let me just kick off, and I'm going to start with Sofia Ramirez. Sofia leads a policy think tank called México Cómo Vamos, which translates as Mexico, how we doing? Yep. And Sofia, you've been thinking about the 40 or so years of integration between Mexico, the US, and Canada recently. If we were to take a look back at what's worked and what hasn't worked, let's say North America, ¿cómo vamos?
North America, how we're doing? Great. Thank you very much, Arturo. This is a pleasure for me being here, and thank you guys for staying up late. I mean, it's been a quite long day already. So I guess the answer to your question is we've got a success story that we need to start sharing in a more structured way. We're facing the 2026 USMCA COSMA review, and probably we are not in that point in which we are ready to tell that story in terms of, or in the terms we need. And I think this is quite important because, I mean, we're still 1/3 of the GDP of the world. The trade openness, of course, means bigger or better prosperity. And prosperity doesn't mean the same for Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans. Of course, those are jobs. But in Mexico, particularly, we talk about also healthcare and education and so on. So I believe this trade openness, we've got the evidence. I don't believe. We got the evidence that it is how it is. And this trade openness has also brought a lot of prosperity to our northern neighbors and partners. For example, the per capita GDP in North America in terms of Canadians and Americans of the US has grown 30% since the 90s. And this is not the case of the Mexicans. In the Mexican case, it's only been growing about 20% in the last 30 years. So those are the things that are going well, but could be better. And I think if we try to figure out how to sail the world, which is a dangerous deep ocean in this very moment because of the political instability or the polarization we are looking at in all three countries, not only in the US, but also in Mexico, and Canadian folks are not going to let me lie about that. I think we are here to talk also about the opportunities, because I don't want to say that things went just wrong. And those opportunities, in my view, of course, include productivity. We have a huge productivity gap that's still going. If you see the broad picture, pretty much the US productivity has gone upwards, as well as some other partners, not only Canada, but also Korea or Turkey. And the productivity in labor productivity terms has been steady in Mexico. And this is one of the big issues we need to address. And of course, this goes together with investment. Every time we talk about productivity, we think, okay, we need capital. And of course, we need venture capital and financial inclusiveness and so on. But I also believe we need to innovate in terms of investment in human capital. And that is not only about training people to do new stuff, but also to invest in the state. And of course, this sounds awkward in a business panel, but if you got better visas and you have multiple entries in those visas and you extend the time that people might stay in some places, you're going to be able to have that attraction of talent within your industries where you need it at the time you need it. So I remember it was last night in the panel with the Tech de Monterrey, and they were talking about what should people study right now if they're at the end of the high school? And the answer was, we don't know what is going to be needed in a couple of years. So I believe the talent attraction is something that is going to be ongoing. And the state, I mean, like the states, all three states, need to put some attention into that particular issue. There are some other things that aren't going too well, but I believe those two, productivity and labor mobility, are the ones that are very much important at this moment. Thank you.
Yeah, and we're going to go deeper into those two topics. Obviously, we have also experts on migration, and I'm going to go to Marcela Escobar in a second to talk about how to reduce those inequities. But let me stay for a second on the integration, the regional integration, and bring in Marina Segarini. You have an amazing background that connects you to Italy, Brazil, and now as managing partner for McKinsey in Mexico. You have three examples of economic integration: the European model, which is full on and stable, the Brazilian South American model with the BRICS or Mercosur, which is quite volatile and maybe even quite bilateral, and the North American model, the USMCA, which sits somewhere in between that spectrum. McKinsey just published a report about global flows and ties. What, in your perspective, is the future of North American integration? Where are we going in this spectrum that I've just defined?
Yeah. Well, with you, some of the events of the last year, especially, there's a lot of questioning on global flows, and speculation on globalization shouldn't, exist because of protection, resilience. The reality, all the countries are interconnected, and they are so deeply interconnected that it's impossible to think about a divided world. Even if we think about North America, which is, by the way, one of the regions that is less dependent on the others. But for example, in consumer electronics, they import 15%. In minerals and metals, about 10%. But then if you look at a granular level, there are like 30 commodities. They actually 70% is what North America imports from the others, because there's some concentration also of origin. So there's a dependency. So I think here is more of a, first of all, from a global perspective, the different flows of goods, of data, of IP, of human capital, of humans and capital, they've been adjusting a little bit over the years in a slow way. Now in the last couple of 2-3 years, there's a movement to actually adjust even more. But the thing is that how do you protecting your resilience, right, and the shocks, but consider the good things of some of these flows, because at the end of the day, some concentration has increased the productivity, has increased specialization, clearly benefiting the whole world. In particular, in North America, we are clearly seeing a good flow of goods, especially the famous nearshoring that everybody's talking about. Mexico, for example, now is the first trading versus US. Clearly, there's a going down dependency on Asia Pacific versus what we see in the region. We are talking about 33 billion, more or less, of flows going from Mexico and up. And this is increasing every year. Every day we see new companies announcing that they are going to either increase capacity or coming up in Mexico. And some of them are newcomers that we're not in the regions. So Canada, both Mexico, we talk a lot about Mexico, but also Canada are the two. They've gained parts that we are from European Union and from Asia Pacific versus, so there's a little bit of concentration, especially in goods. Not necessarily we got this fluidity in talent, for example, because we were talking yesterday at one of the dinner that still Mexican in the US are a fraction of what Koreans are in the US, even though Korean is way smaller than Mexican. So how do we increase some of this flow? On the IP side, we see US being important and a net exporter versus the rest of the world, and this will continue. So net is like, in global flows will continue to exist. but there's a push from governments with some of the acts and decisions, and multinational companies which are responsible for 2/3 of the global flow, are the ones that actually will be shaping a little bit the new landscape.
Thank you, Marina. Just to maybe finish the round on what would be the economic state of the region, we have Marcela Escobari, who is on her second stint as assistant administrator for USAID for Latin America. So Marcela, you are the voice of the US government here unofficially, but you are Latin American as well, and we've known you for many years. The US is thinking about the regional's competitiveness quite a lot, and not just thinking about it, doing a lot of stuff. What are some of the proposals coming out of the US that you think can enhance the competitiveness of North America and catapult it to the global stage?
In terms of the US, what we spent, I was at the Mexico-US high-level economic dialogue on Friday of last week, and today was the high-level security dialogue. And I think I've been to a handful of these, high-level Mexico-US conversations, and I am sure this is the topic that was talked about today, but we're all about the CHIPS Act as an opportunity for Mexico. I was with Secretary Raimondo, and this $50 billion, I mean, what the kind of situation with our Congress is right now, so we're not going to talk about that. But the fact that the stimulus packages that got passed in the US, and particularly this $50 billion incentive package, is an anomaly. It's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the hemisphere. Friendshoring is real, but it is not immediate. It is not automatic. This is the message that keeps coming again and again, that needs to be translated, of what does it mean for Mexico to take advantage of this, right? It can't rest on its laurels of location. This is going to be the most interesting place, but there's some real challenges, right? The places being able to have the regulatory standards that USMCA has on IP, on workforce, and just on clear rules of the game will make or break this moment in time on whether people are going to set up here. And again, the expectation is out of those 50 billion, around 20% can be supply chains that could settle in Mexico. I think the last thing that I would say in terms of priority, that I know is a really, I don't know if controversial, but difficult issue in Mexico, is the energy transition, right? At this point, federal government needs to create clearer rules so that renewables may be able to plug into the grid. Cities have to take ownership on building codes and clean energies. Like, even if it's not demanded here, these companies now require a clean supply chain. So I do think that this is one of the sticking points that Mexico is going to have to be aggressive from a variety of different levels, outside of the federal government, for them to really play on this opportunity. But that it's there and it's time limited is clear.
Thank you, Marcela. So we've got 40-year history in this three-way relationship. We've got global flows going up. We've got the US creating really innovative policy that includes the partners and that has a vision for what productivity in the region can look like. But let's get the voice from up north, all the way up north in Canada, because Peter Lowen is the director of the Monk School for Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Peter, as Canadians look down on us, physically, I mean, and see all of this excitement, all of these investments, Tesla going to Monterrey, and all of these bills. How do you think the Canadians feel about the new political economy of North America?
It's a great question. So the world has changed for Canada and the political economy of Canada pretty dramatically in the last 2 years, but it really goes back to the renegotiation of NAFTA. But the introduction of the Green New Deal, but then especially the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, I would say just candidly, I think really caught Canadian policymakers by surprise that we would find ourselves in sort of a new industrial strategy in which the U.S. would so aggressively reinvest in U.S. industry, and then would set off essentially a subsidy war for a lot of manufacturing concerns in Canada. Now, I don't think that politicians have a problem with that. They love having an excuse to give a lot of money to companies, and now they're in a position where they're in bidding wars for battery factories and other things. But I think they feel like they are playing catch up pretty substantially. I think the larger story there, which is an important one, is that our policymakers have not, the big concern with NAFTA, and Brian Mulroney articulates this very well, was always that NAFTA would become a hub and spoke model where the US was obviously the hub and Mexico was a spoke and Canada was a spoke. And we were basically, it was a set of bilateral relationships and we weren't having a sufficiently robust trade relationship with Mexico. We can talk about whether $50 billion a year of trade back and forth is more than hub and spoke, and Canada certainly does well by being having Mexico as its third largest trading partner, and Canada as Mexico's fifth. I think that's a massive accomplishment, and there's a lot to be said for it. But I just reckon to say that the political economy of it is such that our political class doesn't think of a North American strategy yet. We don't yet think of ourselves as being actually in a North American economy. We still think of ourselves as being in a trading relationship with the United States. There's a bunch of stuff that happens with Mexico kind of externally to that, right, as an externality, but we don't have the sense that we are trying to line up regulatory standards with Mexico, or we're trying to line up labor standards, or we're trying to get serious about commercial exchange and the exchange of people across our borders, because we're still not yet thinking of ourselves as a North American economy the way that commercial concerns in Europe would. The final example I'll just give you, which I just want to think about a lot, is that, and I remember hearing it first from Jesus Ciara Curry, who said, it's not that a Portuguese fisherman and a factory worker for Volvo in Gothenburg, Sweden, think that they're somehow in the same culture or the same society, but they think they're in the same block together. Yeah. That they understand that there's an integrated interest. There's a European interest to be articulated. And I think that not only do we not think about that at an individual level, but at our political level, very rarely are we actually in a North American frame of mind trying to articulate a larger political ambition for the whole region that would go beyond trade and would go to a much deeper level. So the political economy is disrupted. It is different than the one we've operated under for about 30 years, because it is one that's much more focused on industrial strategy. And it's one, I think, in which Canada, frankly, finds itself playing catch up.
Great. And Peter, I'm going to come back to you later to talk about how the bilateral relationship between Canada and Mexico can feed into North American competitiveness, right? But we cannot talk about North American economic integration and leave out two words that are very important for Mexico, which are migration and remittances. And so we have Danny Bajar, who's an associate professor at Brown, who I met when he was a bright-eyed student at the Kennedy School. And he's a senior fellow at the Harvard Growth Lab. Actually, Marcela was our boss for a while, both of our boss.
There's no nepotism.
She still is.
She still is the boss. She still is the boss. So, Danny, tell us about that aspect, right? Of course, none of the treaties that we've signed are migratory treaties fully, right? We know that a lot of migration happens, and it's so essential for the economy of Mexico, at least. What are you seeing in the state of play right now in North America, and what would you like to see going forward for a better integration, including migration?
Thank you. And because I'm a professor, I'm going to talk about something completely different at the beginning.
Perfect. Thank
you. Which I want to share a stylized fact that I think that that it's striking. That and this is in a forthcoming paper we're gonna publish with the U.S. Mexico Foundation, where we're looking really at the trends over time of the competitiveness of the region as a whole compared to other regions in terms of trade and investment. And what you see there is that the North American region has not gained significant market share in the world, combined, and definitely, not as much as the EU, definitely not as much as China. That's completely off of the charts. And I think that when we're talking about integration, including the topic of migration, that should be in top of mind, because um, the real goal of integration is not how much we're going to export to one another, but it's how we can be a region that together we can really be competitive and gain market share. And I think for that to happen, there's a couple of things. One of them has to do with integration. I'm going to get to that in a few seconds. There is a big, important structural issue, right? That has been around since NAFTA was signed in the 90s, which is this was a free trade agreement that was an anomaly because it was two developed countries with one developing country. That reality continues to be. And Mexican productivity has declined over the years, and a lot of that has to do with structural issues. There's a recent paper by a great friend and one of the best Mexican economists of all time, Santiago Levy, who is showing that has to do a lot with the distortions in the market on how small firms that are have low productivity continue to thrive, while maybe the high productivity firms leave the market, which is exactly the opposite of what you would expect. So we're not going to get too much into that, but there is a structural issue that even if integration continues to happen at the pace that we wanted, there are these issues that will have to be dealt by the government, and important reforms will have to happen. Now, having said that, I think the mindset we need to have is like, how can really we fuel integration in a way that makes us more competitive? And I think there, migration is key. Migration is here, migration is massive, and it's here to stay. And the question is like, how do we think about it in a way that it's an opportunity, that it creates opportunities, and not in a way that it's a burden. And I think we're moving slowly in that direction. But there is a lot of research showing the importance of migration in terms of productivity, innovation, transferring technologies, and at the end, what makes us more productive is the ability to do more with the same resources. And people, human capital, are a key for that. So if we don't include migration in this conversation, to try to get even more integration, we are missing out on one of the big components that can really push the region forward. I do want to commend actually Marcela, who has been thinking, I know, on these topics really deeply on how to have migration from the region up to Mexico and from the US perspective in a way that talks about the opportunities.
And so actually, this is a great segue. Thank you for doing part of my job. But let's go to Marcela. Marcela, I think because I'm not an academic, I can take what the academic said and reinterpret it in the way that best fits me. I think what you're saying is when we focus so much on competitiveness and growth, and we leave out promoting economic and social development, including the excluded from Mexico in the project, in this North American project, then we'll eventually hit a wall there. And that's why we're not growing in our market share as a region with respect to other regions in the world. Marcela, pursuing economic and social development is the bread and butter of USAID. When you look at Mexico, what can you bring from everything you're doing around the region that can work precisely in creating that human capital, in creating that opportunity, that equity, that can lead to something you've been championing for a long time, inclusive growth?
No, thank you, Arturo. And such a big question, but let me piggyback on the answer from Danny, because I mean, we've studied migration for a long time. We understand the benefits of migration, but if there was one topic, and I was in the world of academia too, reading all those great papers, I'm now in the world of politics, and there's no issue where the distance between politics and policy is so big as in migration, where you can have all the papers and all the data, and yet migration is incredibly visceral, it's incredibly easy to weaponize, it's politically toxic, and we are living it in the US, and we're living it throughout the hemisphere. We are in a very different place than we have been in decades on this issue. We have a 2,000-mile border. We have people-to-people relationships. Migration has always been in the agenda between Mexico and the US and the hemisphere. But there is, and we've actually known how to manage it, right? Despite all the noise. It's a mixture of enforcement and legal pathways. When we are able to expand both, enforcement by itself is never enough. You need to give people hope and a path. People want to come, want to work, and want to come legally with dignity and in conditions of mutual benefit. Those tools we have expanded in massive ways in Mexico, in the US. We've created, you've probably heard, we just gave temporary protective status to over 470,000 Venezuelans inside of the US. That was politically difficult. We've created the CHNV visa parole program. 30,000 Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Cubans can enter the US per month. This is being challenged in the courts. So we're expanding massively legal pathways and as well thinking about enforcement. But none of that is enough because we have 7.7 million people that have left a failed, mismanaged, corrupt, exploitative after exploitative regime in Venezuela. And that amount of people that have mostly gone to Latin America are flows that we just haven't seen before, right? And actually, migration has increased inside of Latin America 17 times faster than from Latin America to the US, right? So the issue is actually very much in South America. And there we're seeing incredible experiments of integration. Because the fact that Danny talked about is true. If you integrate migrants, if you give them a labor permit, if you let their kids go to school, if you get them health, within very few years they start contributing. The studies are all there. 4.5% increased GDP for all these countries if they integrate migrants. But the political cost now is super important, right? So we have a few countries that are starting to do this, the integration, but it's very fragile. So talk about integration or coordination. This is an issue that has a problem of the commons. If we all do it together, if we all have these kind of integration policies, if we are all bold about it, then this will become an asset. Because we need those people. We need those people in the US. We're at the lowest unemployment rate in the last 71 years. And Mexico needs them. Your population is aging, it's becoming more educated. You have big labor gaps. But you don't have yet a kind of a mechanism to create these labor pathways. And so taking advantage of that opportunity forcefully is a real opportunity for the region, but it's incredibly fragile because of the political cost. And we are in that game right now, and we are making decisions. And today we had a very productive government conversation with the Mexican government about these topics.
Great, and we'd love to hear more about that. And it's really amazing what you can bring from other regions in learning. I'm gonna start moving into what the future looks like, and I'm gonna ask a very similar question to both Marina and Sophia. I think I'm gonna start with Sophia. You've been working on a project about what North America looks like in the year 2050. And there are metrics and objectives, specific proposals. If we can do it relatively quickly, but from what you've heard, feels to me that there's this window of opportunity in front of us for a stronger region. What are some of the ideas that you're bringing to life there?
Well, I would like to start with the idea that, as Marina said, there are several issues that might not stop even though we want them to stop. One of those is migration, but the other one is, of course, commerce. I mean, even though and hopefully it doesn't happen, but even though we wouldn't have a USMCA or something of that caliber, the trade would still be happening. So in those terms, we figure out how to get to the port we want to get in this big ocean liner called North America. And we set up 5 main goals, which are prosperity and quality jobs, economic development, investment, trade, and of course, labor mobility in terms of talent attraction. And on those goals, we set up to 35 indicators, which are just, like a first version of where we need to head. And of course, in those indicators, we are more than happy to join the universities and the other think tanks and the industries, because you, more than I, from my desk, are going to be able to see where we need to be heading. So this version of the indicators is just an invitation for you, all of you, to draft all the metrics we need in terms of where we want to be in 2040 and then in 2050. But before of that, in 2026, where we want to be then, and what are we going to tell the stakeholders? Because the world is not going to be easier. As you said, the migration issues and the security issues are very easily weaponized. And we need to just figure out how to get where we want to get. So I don't want to take more of the time, but I please join us within the card. You have a QR code. Just scan it, and hopefully you get all the indicators.
And we really look forward to seeing what comes out of that. Marina, you do a lot of work around the world in helping countries basically digitize and transform their economy. The North American project, at least what I hear on the headlines, still seems quite manufacturer-based. There's not a lot about the knowledge economy, in my view. Do you have a different view of how North America could look like in the future, and does it become more of a digital ecosystem?
So we all have an aspiration on sustainable, inclusive growth. Behind that, obviously, the growth is a catalyst. We need more productivity. We've seen clearly that industries that have digitalized more have increased in productivities. Financial services, tech, for example, versus the ones that have not. Construction, social home care, for example. So now, and people are concerned about the productivity part. In the US, it's been growing less than it used to be, in the last years. And these are big numbers. If we were to use the same productivity, that would be 10 trillions, for example. Now, what we were recently in a forum with a bunch of CEOs, and we felt that they are all feeling we are on the verge of a tech-led increase in productivity. And this is mostly because of the Gen AI discussion. Majority of that comes from technology that are existing, and a part of it comes from Gen AI. But what we're seeing is that something between 50 and 70% actually of what people do can be substituted. This is a big number, but the thing is that with the advancement of Gen AI, this big number that seems to be very far away actually is being, getting closer by a decade. So many things are happening today, and when we look at the big numbers, it means for US up to 3.6 points in productivity per year. In Mexico, it's 2.9. So it's something that can be huge. Clearly requires technology, digitalization, enablement. It requires a huge reskilling of people.
And while we're in the topic of Gen AI, I'm going to ask Peter for a very brief comment, because Peter, as a political scientist, is studying the perception on AI adoption around different countries. How do you think there's a difference between how that technology will be perceived in the 3 countries that make up North America, and how can Canada and Mexico work together to make North America better?
Yeah, I mean, so what I would just say quickly is that if you kind of survey people, which we do, on what they do every day in their jobs, and you can work out how vulnerable they are to being automated away based on really nice estimates from McKinsey and others. And if you ask people what their perceptions are, there's just a very bad mismatch between what they think their vulnerability to AI is and what their true vulnerability is. So that's not good. The good news for North America is we have more flexible labor markets than any other developed part of the world. So if you're in Europe right now trying to figure out how you're going to reskill people, I mean, just have a good time, but it's going to be a long process getting their jobs reclassified and all this stuff you have to go through. We thankfully have maintained relatively flexible labor markets. So I think that we can actually, in North America, can take quite great advantage of this disruption, and can actually treat workers pretty well by retraining, reclassifying very, very rapidly. I'm self-interested in saying that universities have a role to play in that, but the action is really going to be in the capacity of medium and large-sized firms to do the reskilling and to think more creatively about how they're going to take people and integrate them with technology better.
Excellent, thank you. Danny, you at the Growth Lab have done a lot of work on the idea of productivity not being this accumulation of factors of production. I think your colleague Ricardo Hausman has shown that there has been convergence between even Mexico, the US, and Canada in education levels, in women's participation in the labor force, in all of these things that we thought that if you achieved, you would get that GDP per capita convergence, and it hasn't happened. What is your take on, in this wave of tech-led productivity growth, how does North America find the way to increase its productivity as it should?
That's an easy question.
Thanks.
How much time we have? Well, I think that you're right. I mean, I think that we are at a time in 2023 when it seems like we follow the recipe for growth, but we didn't really get the growth we want, right? So, we stabilize the macroeconomy. Countries in Latin America can borrow in their own currency. Who would have thought, right? There is, institutions that have improved significantly. And I think you're hitting exactly the point. I think what we're learning in the Growth Lab and beyond is that it's all about technology, and it's all about know-how. And productivity still explains 60% of cross-country income differences. So how do you close that gap? And that's a big question. We don't really know what productivity is, but we really think it has to do with the idea of know-how and how firms can become more productive by adopting new technologies, by innovating. And I'm going to go back to what I said before. To a big extent, that has to come from brains moving around rather than moving knowledge in ways that are not effective. A lot of this has to do with our ability to do things that are difficult to explain, that are difficult to learn. The economy is a lot like riding a bicycle. You can only learn it once you do it. You cannot, read it in Wikipedia. So this process of moving technologies across countries is the key, and one of the big drives for that, I would say, is human mobility.
Great, and so we need to be riding the same bicycle all through the region. Let me end with a question about, I guess, a voice that is missing from this panel, because we have government, we have academia, we have the private sector, we have civil society, but we're missing the multilateral international institutions that play a really important role in development and in productivity. Marcela, what is the role of international institutions?
In 31 seconds or less, yeah. Look, the one thing I would say about multilateral institutions or regional organizations, the United Nations, the multilateral banks, from the outside, they seem old and unable to deal with the issues of today. But I have to say that we have to bet on them, is what I'm realizing in this job, right? We all know that our problems are crossing borders and are crossing sectors. Climate change, criminal networks. We spend all day talking about criminal networks. You kind of deal with them here, and they move to another place where the state is not there. Migration is regional. All the really big problems are no longer in one single country. So we need these institutions. And Latin America, to be honest, has not had really effective regional institutions. So we need to use what exists and we need to build new ones. And just to give one very tangible example, Haiti. I know that that might not be on everybody's to-do list. It's definitely on mine. It's a place that is spiraling out of control. Haiti has had problems and crises for decades. This moment is worse than I've ever seen it. It's basically taken over by gangs. Homicides, rapes, kidnappings have skyrocketed. There are 9,000 gang members. There's around 5,000 police, right? So you can imagine what is happening. Kids cannot go to school, livelihoods are shrinking, and we're all kind of looking and saying, well, how do we solve that problem? On Monday, the UN Security Council finally voted to allow a multinational security force from Kenya who's willing to go to Haiti to address these problems. And what will it require? It'll require all of these countries, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, to support that multinational force. And through that UN resolution and a lot of efforts from the US government and around the world, Latin American countries are rallying. Jamaica is going to send 100 troops. Peru is going to send 300 troops. Bahamas, and Mexico, I hope, also contributes to this because we're in this together. And I think without these institutions and without mechanisms for collaboration, we're not going to solve these issues. We have the UN, the LA Declaration of Migration. We have been trying and working together to create these. They're fragile, but I think we have to bet on them.
That's a great reminder that the world is bigger than North America, and Haiti is not that far away from Mexico. But that being said, North America seems to be alive and well, and there's a future, and Sofia is going to help us with a QR code to shape the future of North America together. And I know we cannot define productivity, or that's what my Brown professor said, but having almost 3 rounds of questions with 5 panelists is my definition of productivity. So thank you very much to the panelists.